All right, let's get started on Numbers 11:1. I'm going to switch. So I gave you guys the 1917 edition in the chat room. I'm reading simultaneously out of two different books. I have the latest JPS edition, and then I also have, if you don't own a copy of this book will change your life. The Five Books of Moses by Robert Alter. You need to get this book. It is a requirement, and buy the paper version. Buy the paper book. It's just a lot easier to thumb through than dealing with what's arguably, I don't even know, almost 1,000 pages of paper. So do that. Okay. So I'm flipping between those two. So if you hear lots of page flipping noises, I apologize. So immediately we start with this line, and the people became complainers of evil in the ears of the Lord, and the Lord heard, and his wrath flared, and the Lord's fire burned against them and consumed along the edges of the camp. Okay, so immediately we're starting off with what Alter here calls the riffraff, or the Erev Rav. These are people who went out from slavery with us. They could be Hebrews, they could be another group, they could be the children of mixed marriages between the Israelites and the Egyptians. There's a lot of different ways that this is viewed. But nonetheless, we have this group of just sort of riffraff people, and they're causing trouble. And here's what their problem was. This is Numbers 11:4. And the riffraff that was in the midst felt a craving, and the Israelites too again wept and said, "Who will feed us meat? We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for free, and cucumbers and the melons and leeks and onions and garlic. And now our throats are dry. There is nothing save the manna before our eyes." Okay, so let's talk a little bit about where we're at right now. Everybody's complaining. We have the, backdraft of fire that comes from God, the fire of the Lord. And then the riffraff are complaining about food, right? So we already know that this is a Jewish thing because people are talking about food. So what are they talking about? What's the real issue here? They have manna, whatever that is. We're not quite sure yet. We're gonna talk more about that. But what they really want to know is, who will feed us meat? Okay? That's what they really want. They're literally weeping because they're not getting the food that they want. And something strange happens. I want to see if anyone's paying attention. Look at Numbers 11:5. And I'm actually going to look at your text here, the JPS 11:5. Okay. So something happens here that's really unusual. It starts with, "Who will feed us?" and then it ends on verse 6. There's a use of words that doesn't make a lot of sense. Can anyone catch it? Who will feed us meat? ... There's a strange thing there. So they talk about meat, and then all of a sudden they talk about something else. What are we seeing? And by the way, this is a full contact sport, this Torah study stuff. So if you get the answer wrong, all that's going to happen is that you're banished from Judaism. I mean, that's really not that big a deal, right? Now, come on. That's not what we're talking about. There is no wrong answer. Okay. So Jacob says a whole lot of vegetables. Okay, yeah, so that's kind of weird, right? They're talking about how they want meat. And then all of a sudden they're talking about the most disgusting salad I've ever heard in my life. Cucumbers, melons, leeks, and onions, and garlic. Right? Who will feed us meat? And then all of a sudden they're talking about vegetables. There's one other word, though, other than the vegetables. What's the other thing that they ask for? Or that they're complaining about? There's vegetables, and there's one other thing. Flesh. Well, flesh is what they said. Who will feed us flesh? But what's the other thing? Fish. Got it. It's fish. Okay, so they go from who's going to feed us meat to remember the fish and vegetable platter. Right? So they're going from meat to parv, basically. Okay? That's strange, right? Like if I was going to say, "Oh, I remember this great hamburger I had once. it was really good salad. Like, that doesn't make sense. It's a weird use of words. It doesn't make any poetic sense, and it doesn't make any literary sense. Now, is it an error in the Torah? God forbid. Probably not, though. But it's kind of an unusual thing that all of a sudden they're talking about fish. Well, it does kind of make sense, because you have to remember in Egypt you have the Nile, and the Nile is the principal source of food. So people are talking about what they got out of the Nile. Robert Alter makes an interesting comment, which is that when they're complaining, they start with the most elaborate thing possible. And then they move to something that's a little more practical and a little more realistic. So it would be kind of like going bankrupt and saying, I've lost everything. But you didn't really lose everything. Because the great thing about bankruptcy protection is that you don't lose everything. You lose a lot, but you don't lose everything, right? So it would be kind of like saying, oh, I've gone bankrupt, I've lost everything, I lost my house, right? That's kind of what's happened here. They're sort of correcting themselves. And so there is an interesting kind of little literary thing there. Now, what would have made more sense, actually, if they wanted to talk about all food, what would have made more sense is instead of saying basar, which is flesh, they should have said lechem, bread, because bread is usually the metaphor for food. And in fact, when you look at the prayer Birkat Hamazon, so it's what we say after we eat, you only say it after you've eaten bread. So, that's what they could have said. They could have said, who will feed us bread? We remember the meal we had in Egypt, which was da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So, that's possible as well. Okay, let's see what people are saying here. So, ATL Jew says, I heard a midrash that says manna tasted different depending on the person. So, it's kind of like, what's that movie? Oh gosh, I'm already Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So it's like the snozberries taste like snozberries, that is a terrific midrash. Now we'll find later, the only food description that we have for what this tasted like. It's actually Numbers 11:9, is that it tasted like cream. Sometimes it means the creaminess of oil. It's the creaminess of oil is what the Hebrew is. Charles, welcome Charles, makes the comment, is it like the elephant parable? So there's this parable, I forget, Charles, maybe you know what country it comes from, but it's the idea that a lot of people, blind people or blindfolded people, are all touching an elephant, and they're asked to describe what an elephant is like. So one person is touching the tail, and he says, oh, an elephant is long and thin like a snake. And another person says, oh, he's touching the leg, and he says, oh, no, it's wide around. It's like a tree trunk. And then another person is, touching its side, and it says, no, it's tall and rough. And the reality is that they were all right, but they're also all wrong, because an elephant isn't like one of those things. An elephant is like all of those things. And the way that you perceive something when you're blind, affects your view of it. Excellent points there, you guys. Loved it. Okay, so now we move on. Let's get into, we've kind of gotten now into sort of the 11:9-ish area. So there's an interesting thing here. Let's see if we can find it. Okay, so starting with verse 8, the people would go, so we're talking about the manna now. The people would go around and gather it and grind it between millstones, or pound it in a pestle and cook it in a cauldron and make it into cakes. And its taste was like the creaminess of oil. So, it's an interesting thing here that they're describing in detail what would have been done with manna. And Alter actually, I think, makes a comment here. Yes, he does. A comment on verse 8 that there must be some historical truth to this. This must be based on some piece of literal history in the way that they are describing it so clearly. Now, what's interesting, though, is that there is this strange use of, let me find the actual Hebrew word. It's bedolach, but let me see if I can find it in the JPS and I can read to you. Let's see. Kizara, God, who, Be'ain, yeah, so it's Habedolach, okay? So it's translated as bedellium, and bedellium is a crystal. But the thing about Habedolach is that it could be a misuse of words. It says here in Alter's translation, and he translates it the same way as JPS, even though he thinks there's something kind of screwy with it, that it's a semi-transparent yellowish gum. Later Hebrew, working from what is probably a misinterpretation of the biblical term, uses bedolach in the sense of crystal. So there could be something interesting to that. It could be that this is a story, the story of the manna in the wilderness, could have been something that was passed down for a very long time, but it wasn't written until much later. Not Robert Alter. I keep talking about Robert Alter. Richard Elliott Friedman, who is a great scholar of the it's called the JEPD. It's higher biblical criticism. Basically says that this is an Elohist text because of the use of the term Elohim. It doesn't seem to match any of the other particular biblical writers, the Deuteronomist, the Yahist, etc., etc. So take that for what it's worth. Looks like we have a question here. Greaseberg, good name, asks about 11:6, soul dried away. Well, let's look at it. Okay. So here in so in the later JPS, we have it translated as, now our gullets are shriveled, there is nothing at all but this manna to look to. Okay, and then let's see what we have here, what our friend Robert Alter has to say about it. Let's see. He translated as, and now our throats are dry. So, let's see. So, I don't know, let's see. What does your translation say? If you're looking at 6. But now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all. Okay, so that's really interesting. Let me look here. Veta nafshenu nefesh. Okay. So, nefishenu. Okay, so that might come from nefesh, which means soul. Yishan ain kol. There is nothing but the for us. Okay, so where it's saying soul dried up, I'm guessing is from this word, which is nunfe shin nun vet, or vav, excuse me, which the oo sound could be they or our, or no, excuse me, it's nu, so it's anaknu, it means we, so we or our, and then nefesh, so our soul. Now, here's the thing about Hebrew, is that more than one word, more than one meaning can be described to one word. So nafshenu is the word that's being used here. It comes from the word nefesh, which means soul or spirit, which is why the 1917 translation says our souls were dry, or our soul. It's actually a collective noun. Our soul is dry. That could literally mean our guts. It could mean our tongue. So it can mean a lot of different things. It's just how it's translated. This is the fun of biblical Hebrew, that someone has probably written a whole master's thesis on the use of that one word. So I don't know. I don't know why the 1917 translates it as soul and then the other two translate it as guts or tongue. I'm not really sure. Okay, let's see. Rebecca says that the fox does the same thing. Okay, with the translation soul. Um, let's see. They're saying, David makes the point that it sounds like they're saying that they're tired of it, which is fair. Jacob says even the best dishes get tiresome after a while, and Michael says they have begun to acknowledge it as a mere substitution for what they were familiar with, as opposed to a miracle. Okay, so those are all brilliant points. I think you could argue any one of those, and that it would be absolutely true. Okay, so see, this is fun. This is why I'm going to go on a slight rant right now. This is why I think it's very important for people to learn biblical Hebrew. When it comes to a Shabbat service or any liturgical service, you can get away with transliteration. I mean, you can. Literally. There's no reason on earth to not go into autopilot mode and just read a transliteration. But I'll tell you, when it comes to being able to open the Bible and to learn what it literally says, with the literal word, the fact that this word is not soul, the fact that it's soul but it's also tongue or guts, depending on how you want to translate it, I tell you, that is possibly the most liberating thing in the world. The fact that you have the ability to look at that. For Lord knows how long, religions taught that people couldn't read their own sacred texts. They made sure it was in a language that they couldn't speak or read. They made sure that people were illiterate so they couldn't read them, or they just didn't write stuff down. The truest miracle of the Jewish people is the fact that we have a religion that revolves around reading, and that we have a language that we teach each other so that we can read it. It's just incredible. Anyway, that's enough of my ranting. I used to not always feel that way, by the way. It's one of those things in life where it's sometimes good to do the most difficult thing possible, which is studying an ancient dead language. Okay. As Rebecca just said, all translations are commentary. Yep, and that's absolutely true. And we're learning that tonight. Okay, let's move on a little bit. And let's get to... We're going to skip ahead to... I should have made notes about where I was skipping ahead to. I apologize for not being more organized. Okay, here we go. Okay, let's go to Numbers 11:31. Okay, so they've begged for meat, they got fish, and now we have this situation where... Actually, no, you know what? We're gonna pause before we get to that. I actually want to keep talking about what we were talking about earlier, because it's pretty interesting. Sorry, I'm bouncing around like crazy today. I want to keep talking about what we started with, which is Numbers 11:4, about the meat and fish whatever deal. So, an interesting point here that actually I forgot to talk about, and it's arguably the most interesting. Here's a little quiz. Let's look at Numbers 11:5. 11:5. We remember is the start of that verse. So, we remember the fish that we used to eat for free in Egypt, the onions, garlic, cucumber, blah, 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 the buffet. Is there a word that stands out as being strange to anybody here? In that sentence, just in that sentence. There's, 12 or 14 words, so you have a fighting chance that you're gonna find it. And it's not cucumbers and it's not garlic. So there you go, I've made it even easier. For free. Jacob is on fire tonight. For free. What is strange about the Israelites, the Hebrews, complaining about getting fish for free in this particular context? Why is it weird to read about the Israelites talking about getting something for free? Slavery. There you go. They were slaves. ATL Jew says slavery is stability. And David says they were slaves to get food. Okay, yeah, so it's strange that they use the word free, that they got fish for free. So, Stephanie, actually, my fiance, brought this up to me, that it's interesting that Why did they have to wander the desert? They had to wander the desert because they had to get used to the idea that they had to fend for themselves and that they were responsible for their own lives. Now, towards the end of this week's Torah portion, we learn a really interesting lesson about that. But I want you to think about what Egypt is like, what it's like to be a slave. And we could even talk about slavery, in the United States, and what that was like. That the slave master, in American literature, there's a theme, which is the thankful slave. So it's the idea of slaves who would stand around and they would talk about whose master was better. Well, my master is so nice. Well, my master gave me a wife. Well, my master would never sell my children. Well, my master gives us the best food and the best clothes. Oh, so-and-so, how can you travel from one plantation to another? Well, because my master is so great. And the thing about, at least American slavery, the chattel slavery system, was that, this was the best psychological warfare that the master ever committed against the slave, right? Was being able to get the slave to a point where the slave would say, I love my master. Now, what's interesting is that exact phrase, I love my master, is actually found in the Bible, and it's found much, much earlier than this. And it talks about a slave who refuses to be freed because he loves his master. Jacob uses the phrase Stockholm Syndrome. Yeah, and that's very, very fair. ATL Jew says we have to take this from the proper context, that it's the house Negro versus the field Negro. Yeah, absolutely. And they used a much more horrible word back then. So, it's an interesting point. You're right, it's a Malcolm X quote. I should know that. I'm a Malcolm X fan. It's an interesting thing here, the I love my master type of mentality. And I was watching a program not too long ago that was talking about African American culture today as an outgrowth of slave culture, and basically like what things culturally were kept in the African American community. And so, like, one of the comments that this social commentator made, and I'm gonna preface by saying he was a very politically conservative social commentator. So this an African American gentleman. So this is not meant to be offensive, but I'm merely quoting him. He said, if you look at food, African American soul food, he said you can actually trace it back to the basically garbage that the master would have thrown away. So, as an example, chitlins. Okay, so chitlins are pig guts, and they're cleaned out and they're fried. And that's, or pork rinds, is another example. These were all the scraps, the leftovers. And now today, I live in Atlanta, so I go to grocery stores, and I literally see like frozen bags of chitlins. Other examples. Catfish was considered throwaway food. Certain kinds of wild game were considered throwaway food. And so we look at these foods that are so connected with soul food, right? That are connected to the southeastern, African American cultural experience. And you trace them back and you find that there's some kind of root in slavery for them. And so, I wonder here if in this text we have kind of a, pardon the pun, but a taste of it, right? Who will feed us meat? We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for free, right? And so I wonder if there's any kind of line that can be drawn, Food is an amazing, piece of cultural baggage. So, I don't know. Michael asked the question, did the Egyptians not like fish? They did eat fish. Fish was a staple diet in Egypt. I don't think that it's the exact same thing, but I think it's an interesting thing that if you think about food, the culture of food and the history of food is a great way to see history overall. And this may be, a little piece of that. That may be a remnant of that. Now, when this text was written down, people didn't think about that sort of thing. But I think that if we do a little biblical archaeology within the text, I think that there is, a little bit of a sense of that. And the other thing here is that it says, who will feed us meat? It doesn't say, how will we get meat? Or how will we find for ourselves meat? It says, who will feed us meat? So the reason that it says that is that it shows dependence. Who is the master that's going to give me my food? Right? This is very different than the way free people view their lives, which is, how am I going to get for myself what I want? Versus, who's going to give me what I want? And I tell you, I really think that we can learn a lot from that. The sense of, the wrong kind of dependence. The sense that we can't help ourselves and that we can't help other people. That we have to wait for, someone to give us something. So Griesberg says, even here and now, some throwaway fish are enjoyed by the poor. Bonita, buffalo, spoonbill. Yeah, whitefish, absolutely. ATL Jew says maybe Israelites were asking who will be our master. Now, that's an interesting comment because, one of the things that's in the Torah is this argument, basically, that the Jewish people are still slaves. It's just that we went from being slaves to an earthly person, Pharaoh, to God. We are literally God's slaves on earth. Now, that's a very harsh way of viewing it, and theologically, I know that doesn't work for me. But there are people who've made that argument, that we have the yoke of the Torah in the same way that we had the yoke of servitude in Egypt. Now, all of this aside, it's the idea of being slaves in Egypt is interesting, and Griesberg actually made the comment about, not all slaves are chattel slavery. The reality is the type of slavery that we had in Egypt was not chattel slavery the way that, the Torah even talks about chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is what happened in the Bahamas and in the United States with people from Africa. What we had was indentured servitude. It was economic servitude, and that's a whole other thing. But the bigger point that I want to drive home is this idea of a slave mentality, a slave way of viewing yourself, that you are just waiting for that person who's going to be your good master. And we have to ask ourselves, is that what we really want for our lives? I would argue, you look at people who suffer from different types of abuse situations and have post-traumatic stress from it. People who've been in really bad relationships, who, when they get out of them, when they're free from them, the first thing they do is find someone to abuse them. It's like the first thing they do is they try to find someone who's going to beat them up or take their money or whatever the case may be. And it does go back to, who's going to feed me meat? Who's going to be my good master? Okay, so now that we've had that horrible, depressing conversation, let's Griesberg just said, so many people live with an endless search for the master. Yep, that's absolutely true. And I think that, this is where believing in God actually gives us freedom. Because the more we meditate on God and the more we meditate on the idea of God as our master, I think we can actually break free of the idea that God is Zeus on a mountain shooting lightning bolts at us and giving us what we deserve, which is sometimes good and sometimes bad in a, precarious sort of way that never really makes any sense. That God is actually, something that is rooted within us, that is also outside of us, that is distant from us and yet close to us, and that Hashem literally penetrates everything. I was about to start going into the Star Wars line about what the Force is, but I think there might be some truth to that, right? We are both the essence of God and not the essence of God. We are godly stuff searching for God. We are made in God's image, searching for our own image. And I think that that can help us to break free from this sort of it, who is my master, who is running the show, um, way of viewing the world, which I think is a dangerous way to view the world. I think it's dangerous to think that you are a victim in a play of life that operates independent of you. That is a very dangerous way of viewing yourself. And a lot of people, I think, view themselves that way. They see themselves as the hopeless victim to the tragedy of life, And they don't know that life works differently than that. Okay, so let's move to... Okay, we're going to keep talking about meat, but the story changes slightly. Okay, so now we're in Numbers 11:31. And a wind moved onward from the Lord and swept up quail from the sea and left them over the camp, about a day's journey in every direction all around the camp, and about 2 cubits deep in the ground. Or deep on the ground, rather. And the people arose all that day and all that night and all the next day and gathered the quail. The most sparing gathered 10 homers, and they laid them out for themselves around the camp. The meat was still between their teeth, it had not yet been chewed. And the Lord's wrath flared against the people, and the Lord struck every great blow against the people. And the name of the place was called Kibroth HaTava'ah, for the people buried the ones who had been craving. Okay, so this is the Pit of Craving, or the Field of Craving. It's translated different ways, or the Burial Ground of Craving. So, what do we have? Let's sum up the whole story. People are begging for meat. God says, you're not going to get meat, you've got manna. Okay, never mind, I will give you meat. So, God gives these quail. They eat the quail, and then God decides to blow a terrible plague at them. Okay? Now, reading Alter, it's an interesting point. This may, again, just as we talked about how the manna may have been a historical event, the quail from the sea may have actually been a historical natural occurrence as well. Robert Alter says about 1131, there may be a realistic kernel to this miraculous event. Flocks of migratory quail from the sea do cross over the Sinai, where, exhausted from their flight, they are easy to trap. So you have to imagine these migratory birds who go on this very long journey. They get exhausted, they come down, they're too exhausted to quickly fly back up, and then they're caught. Let's think about the miracle itself. We're talking about it was a day's walk radius, basically. Or not radius, diameter across. Okay? So, from where you were standing, it would take a day to walk to the end of where the birds are, in either direction. And the fact that it talks about, from every direction around the camp. In Near Eastern and in ancient ways of thinking, there's 4 corners to the earth. So when it says in every direction, it's talking about north, south, east, west. Now, it says something kind of gross here, that basically they laid out all this meat and they cooked it, and that they chewed it so hurriedly that they didn't even finish chewing the food. That literally there were pieces of food stuck between their teeth. They were eating it so quickly and so voraciously. And that it was for that, lack of honor to the fact that they had experienced a miracle. I mean, there's no mi chamocha, right? There's no song of the sea. There's no song of the quails, right? I mean, they just grabbed it and ate it, They just ate. And there's just, it's gluttony. Thank you. The perfect term. Now, going back to the beginning of this text, what is God saying? God is saying, I have brought you out of Egypt. I'm going to sustain you with rations, basically. And that's going to be that. You're going to have this stuff that's this sort of creamy cake thing. and you're going to eat it, and that's going to sustain you, and it's going to give you the opportunity to learn to be whatever you need to be, and then you are going to, be a truly free people in the land of Canaan. And instead, we have the slave mentality of, I want my meat. And God doesn't want that. God wants us to live on manna until we experience true liberation, right? God doesn't want us to have the bling bling, God wants us to have a simple life. And in that simplicity and the ability to sustain ourselves, we weren't starving in the desert. We had food. It just wasn't the greatest food in the world, right? It's okay. This is voluntary simplicity. People are, and it's a miracle. The fact that we are sustained in the desert is a miracle. But instead, what the Bible is talking about here is a sense of, I would rather have a false sense of luxury and be a slave than live modestly and be free. And that is such a screwed up way of viewing life, but I'm sure there's a lot of people who do. And I'd love to see if anyone has any examples of that. Let's read some of the comments here. Could this be a metaphor for the Torah, that, meat equals Torah? I'd be curious to know, ATL Jew, like where, what you sort of draw out the logic further, because I'd be interested in hearing more of what you have to say. Rebecca's right. Typically, when we talk about Torah, bread is usually the metaphor that's used. Now, it could be that when it talks about meat, basar, instead of lechem, this could just be a mixed metaphor. That what the author could have said was lechem. Instead, the term meat was used. I don't think... One thing about the Torah is that we often try to look for parallels, and we try to look for consistency. Consistency only works when you think about the idea of one generation of writers, right? So one generation of writers authoring a particular piece of text, like Deuteronomy. Then the metaphors don't mix. There's a lot more continuity. Bread equals Torah. It could be, for this writer, meat equals Torah. Who knows? I mean, really, who knows? Aubrey makes a great point. How do we make sense of the allegory where Hashem punishes the blank out of people in a world where we see God in a less naive way? We search for God, but getting too close results in death by fire, and too much complaining gets you quail. Vis-a-vis Korach's rebellion. So Korach will actually, I think, is the next, not the next one, but the one after that Torah portion, if not the next one. Human history is trying to find that divine image in ourselves, but we are warned about what might happen if we find it. How do we hold both images if being free and claiming it via rebellion is also being punished? Okay, so, wow, there's a lot to work with there. I think we should keep having this discussion in the chat room. And I will leave it to there. But I will give my own opinion on this. There is a fear amongst the Hebrews of getting too close. So we have the story of Nadav and Avihu. This is one of my favorite stories. I talk about it so much that it drives people crazy. There's a lot to be said about that story. They offered the foreign fire and were killed by God, in theory, because of it, right? So we have this story where people were begging for food, they got it, and God destroys them. We have stories in the prophetic texts, the Nevi'im, about, God is going to use the Babylonians as an agent of divine will to destroy us for idolatry, right? So the question that's being asked is, how do we reconcile that type of theology with the theology that we have today? So I'll give several sort of talking points. It's not a full answer, but it's talking points. Talking point number one that I would give is that the Torah was written the Bible, well, I'll take the whole Bible, was written over a very long period of time by a lot of different kinds of people and a lot of different kinds of situations. And that the theology that they had changed over time. Now, there's a perspective that religion evolves in a single direction, right? So I don't like this way of viewing religion, but some people have it, that once upon a time we were all animists, and we all lived, to the land, and we were connected to the land, and then we all started worshiping goddesses. And then all of a sudden, when we stopped worshiping goddesses, we started worshiping gods. And then we became monotheists, and now we're atheists. Like that's like, if you want to take all of a master's degree in divinity, that's basically what religious history is summed up as. I think that's unfair because religion's more like an evolutionary tree. It kind of forks off in different directions. Sometimes it collapses here and grows in a new way. I don't think that religion is necessarily moving in one direction. I don't think that theology is moving in one direction. I think it sprouts into lots of little ones. And some of those sprouts die out, and some of them grow and become new sprouts. I do, however, stepping back from this, think that there is a moral arc to the universe, and that to borrow from the author Robert Wright, there is a sense in religion of non-zero sumness. And what I mean by that is that people are able to start seeing each other in win-win situations. And when religion has its sort of epic moments, it's generally when, in the course of human history, groups of people have managed to see the divine in each other and to really see each other's humanity. So one of the things that religious historians can't figure out is something that happened called the Axial Age. And it was a history of time where literally all world religion exploded. And there was this huge shift towards prophetic religion. And you had the growth of lots of new religions and new religious movements, and no one really knows why. There's lots of theories about it. The simplest answer is that it also coincided with the growth of the market economy. So what happened was you had people getting to know each other, and they were trading with each other. They needed each other, One of the ways, so like there's a question of why haven't we had literally mutual assured destruction? Why hasn't the world exploded yet? For all of the horrible things that we have and all of the massive weapons that we have, why haven't we all died yet? Why hasn't sort of the Terminator 2 Judgment Day type of thing happened yet? And the reason why is that we need each other, Not to talk politics, but China needs us, and we need China, right? Different countries need each other. Different nations need each other. So what religious theorists believe is that because of the growth of the market economy, people got to know each other. And all of a sudden, that person that you were trading salt for animal hide, or, whatever, you were fixing his wagon, or whatever people were doing back then, that when you met that other person and you saw that that person had a need and that you had the ability to fulfill it, it created a sacred relationship. That's why the Torah has in it business laws. We can't cheat people. We have to have accurate weights and measures. We can't lie to people in the market. You can't eat fish without scales. There's people that have argued the reason why you can't eat fish without scales is that you can't serve people or sell people gutted fish, and that you shouldn't do that because it's a way that you can scam people. You can sell them dirty, rotten fish. The way to tell if a fish is clean is by looking at its scales. So there's actually an argument that's made that this law in kashrut is actually a marketplace law. Now, that's a conjecture. No one really knows if that's true. But that's an example. There's a moral arc to the universe, and we are, I think, moving closer and closer towards that. And perhaps our religion and the history of our religion shows these little bursts of humanity that happen. And I think that these bursts are really grounded in godliness. So I hope that that answers that question. Let's see. We've got all kinds of comments here. I don't even know where to begin because there's so many people talking here. So, Aubrey asks another question here about how do we unify the God of this story with our modern notion of the absolute, who probably can't slap anyone in that way? Here's what I would ask. Why is it incumbent on us to unify it? Right? I know that that's probably not the answer that you want to hear, but why do we? Why is there a rule out there that says that it has to make sense? We come from a Western society that's inspired by the Greeks, and the Greeks wanted everything to be rational. Sometimes life is confusing and doesn't make sense. This is another sort of line that I use all the time with people. I want you to think, this is actually a fun exercise. Think of the most complicated relationship that you have with another person. Everyone has that. Sometimes it's a parent, sometimes it's your child. Think of a relationship that you have that's just so filled with that just you can never quite get it right, or you're kind of walking on eggshells, or 1 minute it's really fantastic and the next minute it's not so fantastic. Quickly in the chat room, does anyone have a relationship like that? You don't have to say who it's to, but does everyone get what I'm saying about a complicated relationship of some kind? If you don't hang out around other people, then I could see you not answering this question. But yeah, okay. So we have a few people who've at least said yes. Oh, tons. Here we go. Okay. I want you to think about how complicated that relationship is and how much of a pain in the you-know-what it is. Okay? And think about how much time you've probably spent trying to keep it from being complicated, and how much time you've spent trying to figure out what's in that other person's head. How can they not see things my way because I am right and they are wrong? Because that's how all people think, right? We're right until we're wrong. We're always right until that one time when we were wrong, right? So think about that relationship and how complicated and messed up and screwy it is, but at the same time, you're still in that relationship, so you get something out of it. There's something positive in there somewhere, right? And that's why you cling to it. That's one relationship with one human being. That's all it is. One relationship with one human being. It's no more complicated than that. If you wanted to, you could completely strip yourself of that relationship. You could. With the exception of if that relationship is to a small child that you are responsible for taking care of. Literally, any other relationship, you can always get a divorce. You can always stop talking to your mother or father. You can always, not talk to that relative anymore, or stop being friends with that person, or stop going to that synagogue where that other person is, right? You could do that. It'd be harsh. It would hurt. You don't want to do it, but you could, right? And then that problem, that difficult, complicated, painful, sometimes amazing, sometimes not relationship would go away. And you wouldn't have to deal with it anymore, okay? That's one relationship with a human being, okay? Now, let's step back. We are talking about God. We are talking about the creator of the universe, who is both the universe and the creator and the creation, and yet none of those things. Every time we talk about God, this is a concept called negative theology. Every time we talk about God, we have to pull back and say, but that's not God. So if we say God is great, well, we can't say God is great. Because if we say God is great, then we are defining what greatness is, and therefore defining God. And that puts a limitation on God. God can't be limited. So we can't say God is great. We can't say God is good. We can't say God is bad. We can't say God is insignificant. We can't say God is significant. We can't say that God is us, but we can't say that we're not God. Right? Because we can't define God. It's too big. It's too beyond our grasp. Okay? Why do we think that that relationship should be simple? Right? Why do we think that relationship should be simple? If we have one human relationship that we can't get out of, that's complicated and messed up and screwed up, and that person's just a sack of meat with a brain between its ears, and maybe not if you really don't like that person, then why do we think that a relationship to the entire universe of which we are made and yet not would be simple and would be straightforward and would be easy? It makes absolutely no sense. The more that I meditate on that, the less sense it makes. And so I know that that's not the answer to the question of how do we reconcile all of this? How do we make sense of God loves the Jewish people and yet God apparently hates it when you have poor eating habits, right? Like that doesn't work, right? But you step back from it a little bit. You step back from it and you have an experience that, I forget the name of the writer who called it this, but it's the Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans. So Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans. Look that up. Read about that. Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans. So Mysterium, mystery, Tremendum, tremendous, et Fascinans, fascinating. It's the experience that is so huge and so awful, not awful like, but having reverence full, that we are drawn to it like a moth to a flame. But it's going to kill us because it's that tremendous. All throughout the Bible, it talks about prophets who didn't want to be prophets. There are very few prophets in Jewish tradition who were like, awesome, I am so glad that God is talking to me right now, because listen, all I was going to do is hang out at the well and maybe pick up a new wife, No, it was terrifying, and they begged God to not be a prophet, because being a prophet changes your life forever. It's a mysterium tremendum et fascinans. It's this huge thing that you just can't deal with, and yet you want to deal with it. It's the same root of why do we search for some sort of congruency? Why do we search for this text to make sense? Because it's what we got to work with, right? And it doesn't make sense, and it hurts, right? Leviticus 20:13, where it talks about taking rocks and hurling them at gay men and killing them, is horrible. We're still reading the book, right? Mysterium tremendum et fascinans. There's something in here that we are discovering, and we are annihilated by it. And yet we keep coming back for more. And particularly the exciting thing about doing that online is that there's nothing else bribing us, right? No one's coming for the coffee or the snacks or the brisket or whatever the case is, right? We came here for Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans. That's pretty cool stuff, I think. All right, it's 9 o'clock Eastern Time, so I'm going to call it quits. I have a habit of staying online for about 5-10 minutes after the end of a class, just to answer any questions that you may have. I know that there's a lot that we didn't, get to talk about in this week's Torah portion. It's only an hour, so we do the best that we can. I won't be recording this. I will broadcast for a few more minutes. If you have any questions, comments, anything like that, we can talk about it. Please, please, please give a donation. Please give a donation. We are a nonprofit organization. We rely on your donations in order to survive. In order for this to exist, you have to give. It's just that darn simple. And here's what happens. I had a rabbi tell me this once. He said what happens is cool projects, Jewish projects, come along. He's been a rabbi for a while. He said, cool Jewish projects come along, and we get excited about them, but then we don't volunteer, and we don't donate, and we don't show up. And then, so what happens? What happens is that those things go away, right? Because there's no support. And then you know what happens? 6 months later, we're all sitting around going, gosh, wouldn't it be great if there was like some website you could go to where like you could do online Torah study and like Shabbat services? Well, I wonder why that didn't work out. Oh yeah, that. Yeah, well, I was busy that day. Or well, I had a bill I had to take care of, so I just couldn't, I couldn't donate that one time. Right? We all do this. I do this. I do this. So I understand completely where you're coming from. But we have to support projects that we believe in. We have to support musicians that make great art. We have to support photographers. We have to support writers by buying their books. If you want beautiful things to exist, you have to help create beauty. So again, I'm going to post here $5 or $10, guys. $5 or $10. It keeps the website going. It gives me the ability to continue to work towards making the websites better. It gives us all the technology that we need. It gives us the ability to produce all the content. 200,000 people a year engage in this network. 200,000, right? All of us, Addie and David and Brian and, everybody here gives to make 200,000 people, to give 200,000 people Jewish lives. That's pretty spectacular. So step up and help make it happen, okay? All right, well, thank you very much for coming. I'll stick around for a few more minutes and answer any other questions that you have. This is the only event for this week, so come back next Monday, May 27th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and Brian is going to be leading the class. Take care.